Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some pretty expected but still sad news that Joe Pavelski has announced his retirement from the NHL. It has been a few years since Pavelski was with the San Jose Sharks. In fact, the past 5 seasons he has spent with the Dallas Stars, but he was such a legendary figure within the Sharks organization that it is definitely worth making a video discussing his illustrious career. Now, he was drafted back in the 7th round in 2003, and most of the time 7th rounders are rather overlooked. It is quite rare for them to actually become NHL players, and it is even rarer for them to become impact NHL player. There are teams in the league who haven't hit on a 7th rounder in decades at this point, so it is not that much of a surprise that there really wasn't any fanfare when Joe Pavelski was originally selected. And one of the major reasons for why he went in the 7th round was primarily due to his skating. Even without jersey numbers, it would be very easy to pick out Joe Pavelski on the ice amongst 9 other skaters because of just how unique he is in terms of his skating, primarily due to the fact that it is so slow. But Joe Pavelski is nothing if not a hard worker, and he did not let that hold him back. And after being drafted and over the next few years, he worked his way up to the AHL squad and eventually to the NHL squad. And it wasn't an immediate impact at the NHL level. It's not as though he came in and won the Calder Trophy for best rookie and suddenly made a name for himself instantly. It took a few years to get there, but he really started to make himself known around the wider NHL in the playoffs of the 09-10 season. That first series against the Colorado Avalanche that Joe Pavelski absolutely dominated and ended up earning himself the nickname Little Joe. This is because, of course, the Sharks already had a Big Joe in Joe Thornton on the team. So it was a bit of an unfair nickname in a way because it kind of put him in the shadow of Joe Thornton, but still an incredible outbreak performance for Joe Pavelski, who then continued the 2010s decade with incredible and consistent performances over and over again. 60-point seasons, 70-point seasons, 30-goal, 40-goal seasons, and it should be noted, this was a time in the NHL where scoring was pretty down. The 14-15 season, Art Ross was won by Jamie Benn's 87 points, just barely over a point per game season. If Pavelski had had his prime years over the 2020s instead of the 2010s, he probably would have hit 80 to 90, perhaps even 100 points at some point. He was just that great. It's just that it was at a time in which scoring was a bit down. And over the few years from 09-10, he managed to really make a name for himself, not just in the shadow of Joe Thornton, which ended up transitioning his nickname from Little Joe to the Big Pavelski, and he was certainly worthy of that being the case. And Pavelski played on teams captained by Patrick Marleau, Rob Blake, Joe Thornton, but at the end of the 2014 season, after the Sharks were reverse swept by the Los Angeles Kings, Doug Wilson actually stripped the captaincy from Joe Thornton, and the Sharks played without a captain for the entirety of the 14-15 season, a year in which Joe Pavelski was still his usual consistent self. And as such, going into the 15-16 season, Pavelski was named the new captain of the San Jose Sharks, and it's not that much of a coincidence that that very same year, the San Jose Sharks would make it to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time in franchise history. Pavelski would help lead them to that point with an incredible playoff performance, only really overshadowed by the even more incredible playoff performance of Logan Couture, but Pavelski was still close to a point per game player over those 24 games, 14 goals to go with it. And the Sharks, unfortunately, would end up just coming a bit short of winning the ultimate goal. But that began sort of the last hurrah for the San Jose Sharks organization over the next few years. And that brings us, of course, to the 18-19 season. The final year of Joe Pavelski's contract really felt as though this would be one last crack at it for the San Jose Sharks. And it seemed to be going quite well throughout the regular season. The Sharks figured things out. They were looking very good and strong going into the first round of the playoffs, but they would face off against their now new rival, the Vegas Golden Knights. And of course, this story is well known, but it is very fun to retell. Game 7 against the Golden Knights, the Sharks trailing 3-0 with just a few minutes to go in the third period. It was Joe Pavelski, the Sharks captain, who goes down with the injury after the combination play between Cody Eakin and Paul Stastny causes him to fall over, and the Sharks get that 5-minute major. And it just goes to show the types of feelings that the Sharks dressing room had for their captain, that they were able to rally around that injury and not only manage to put themselves a goal on the board to get themselves back in the game, not only managing to tie the game up at 3, but taking the lead back as well, 4-3, and eventually culminating in that legendary playoff goal by Barclay Goodrow to finish off the Golden Knights, to come back from 3-1 down in the series. And I can't technically say it was all because of Joe Pavelski, since he technically wasn't on the ice, but you might not have had the same result if it was pretty much any other player on the team going down with that injury. But because the captain, because the heart and soul Joe Pavelski ends up dropping down, the Sharks roar their way back. But that's not where the story ends in 18-19. It seemed as though Pavelski would be out for the remainder of the playoffs. It was a pretty serious injury, and yet we come to the second round, Game 7, this time against the Colorado Avalanche. Pavelski miraculously manages to return to the lineup, and not just as a sort of name on the board where he plays just a few minutes. In fact, he made a huge impact in that game, scoring the first goal to give the Sharks the 1-0 lead, and even getting the primary assist on the second goal to make it 2-0 San Jose, which of course helped them close out that one and move on to the third round. Unfortunately, that's where they would run out of steam against the St. Louis Blues. We know the Blues would go a bit headhunting, so to speak, and multiple Sharks players would fall out with an injury, and eventually they would lose. But it was still an incredible run, highlighted by Joe Pavelski, really showing himself as a true captain of the San Jose Sharks. Now, at the end of that season, his contract was up, and Doug Wilson made the tough and likely incorrect choice of instead re-signing Erik Karlsson and allowing Pavelski to walk, where he would sign a 3-year deal with the Dallas Stars. And ever since then, he has been still an extremely productive and consistent player with the Dallas Stars. In fact, the only small downturn that he's really shown has been in this year's playoffs, where he wasn't super effective, and that's perhaps why he has decided to actually retire on a bit of a high note in his career. But he was still absolutely incredible going into his 40-year-old season in the NHL. And with this retirement, Joe Pavelski, unfortunately enough, will never manage to win the Stanley Cup, and instead will retire with the record for most playoff games played in a career without a Stanley Cup championship, which is, kind of a sad record to hold. But at the same time, being able to play over 200 playoff games, show yourself as being in those incredibly tight and exciting games over and over again, find yourself on some incredible teams thanks to your own contributions. Pavelski was a massive contributor to the Dallas Stars' success over these last few years, and a massive contributor to the San Jose Sharks' success over a good decade and a half in the NHL. And so the question now becomes, is Pavelski a Hall of Fame player? It's a bit tough to say. He doesn't necessarily have the individual accolades that usually surround these Hall of Fame candidates. There's no Art Ross trophies, Hart Memorial trophies, Maurice Richard trophies, or anything of that nature. He's always been near the top of the standings in terms of points and goals, but he's never been quite at the top, so he doesn't get any of these big individual awards. Having said that, he's probably a bit more of an inductee into the Hall of Very Good, which is right outside the Hall of Fame. But we saw the Sharks retire Patrick Marleau's number last year. The Sharks are going to be retiring Joe Thornton's number this year, and I imagine the legendary number 8, the Big Pavelski, will be joining those two former teammates of his in the Sharks rafters sometime soon. Class dismissed.